Hello and welcome. I'm Owen Leach from Narcity Media, co-chair of the conference and events committee at RTDNA as well. Thank you all for logging in with us today for this timely discussion about going back to work and going back to the newsroom after COVID. We've got three great panelists joining us today, but we're just going to give it a few seconds to make sure that everyone can join us. So hold on. Thanks so much. Okay, let's get started. As I mentioned, thank you for joining this RTDNA webinar, Never Going Back, What COVID Taught Us About the Future of the Newsroom. We've got three great panelists with us today. First, Dr. Wendy Sukier, founder of the Diversity Institute and professor of entrepreneurship and strategy at Ryerson University, and co-author of the bestseller Innovation Nation, Canadian Leadership from Java to Jurassic Park. Sukier is one of Canada's leading experts in disruptive technologies, innovation processes, diversity, and inclusion. Kevin Delaney, co-founder and CEO of Charter, a firm focused on improving workplace dynamics by bridging research to practice on what a workplace can and should be. He was founding co-editor of Quartz and has held senior editorial positions at the New York Times and Wall Street Journal. Dr. Peter Lynn, director of primary care initiatives at the Canadian Heart Research Centre. He lectures and speaks throughout the world, maintains two busy family practices in Toronto, and appears regularly on CBC Radio Toronto, and as recently as this morning. And moderating the discussion today is Richard Southern, an award-winning journalist with City News. He covers the ins and outs of provincial politics at as the Queen's Park reporter for City News 680, and also hosts the nightly business report on City News TV. All right, I'll leave it with you, Richard. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Owen. I'm a big Narcity fan, by the way, so appreciate that. Great work. All right, this great panel, and this is an interesting topic, and I'm glad to be moderating this because I have been doing several hours of live radio and TV from my living room and from my balcony for the past 18 months. Never thought that would be the case, but it's actually working. So the title for today's session does pose a provocative question. While the course of the pandemic might allow for a fuller return to the newsroom, does going back actually make sense? Should we all really go back? Have we learned anything during COVID that might allow us to fix some of the systematic issues that have plagued our workplaces in general and newsrooms in particular? What approaches can we take to make sure decisions about the future of work in the newsroom don't negatively impact equity-seeking groups that have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic? And of course, how do we do all this safely? We've met our great guests. I'm going to start with you, Kevin. Big, broad question just to get things rolling here. You know, after mastering the technical challenges of working from home or working exclusively in the field, should we go back to the newsroom, Kevin? What do you think?
I think the answer is very clearly yes. And what the reason for that is research shows that the hybrid work configuration, that's basically where you're working remotely a few days a week and working in an office a few days a week, is actually the ideal configuration. It's what we should all have been doing for the last several decades, probably. The reason for this is that when you're remote, you're able to do focused individual work in a way that's actually a lot harder when you're in an office. You might, if you have a significant commute, you might be able to use that time for working or for your family. And it gives you flexibility that allows people to better balance their personal and their professional lives. But it's really important that people also come together, and that is for just a culture, cohesion, trust, and also collaborative aspects of work, such as brainstorming, coming together to talk about stories and coverage. And there are aspects of that that are founded in the importance of fundamental human contact and relationships that really benefit from people being together. So the answer is people should definitely be going back to the office, but not 5 days a week. There should be more flexibility and a hybrid option.
Wait, so you're saying we should go back part-time or hybrid because what we collaborate better. That's what the advantage to the newsroom is, you're saying?
Well, basically there are two types of work that we do. There's the individual focus work. That might be writing an article or a script or something like that. And actually you benefit from from being remote and being on your own. Actually, if if you're able to, in doing that, research shows that open plan offices like newsrooms are actually like kind of stressful and actually not super conducive to the sort of to people doing their best work all the time. So that's one kind of work. And then the second kind of work is working collaboratively, planning stories, doing things like that. As we know, that's not always ideal for doing over Zoom. And then there's a dimension of actually just like being good colleagues with each other and having some sense of esprit de corps and culture that's really hard to do when you're little boxes on a Zoom screen all the time. And so that really benefits from being in person.
Yeah, I know it's going to differ from outlet to outlet and from individual to individual, but like for me, like the time I would spend commuting or, chit-chatting with my colleagues, I'm now spending talking to my sources, working on stories. Like I produced more content from home than I ever produced from the newsroom. Like, I mean, I shudder at the thought of going back to the newsroom, but I know that's going to differ from person to person. You certainly make some good points, Kevin. We're going to come back to that. I mean, it's a great discussion, but I want to bring Wendy into this. Wendy, how do we ensure that the inequalities that currently exist in workplace aren't made worse by the work at home environment? If we're going to do this hybrid thing going forward, how do we make sure that those inequalities aren't made worse? Do you think, Wendy?
Yeah, I think, I think that Kevin raised some important points. All I would say is the more that we can customize environments to individuals' needs and desires, the better. And so I'd be disinclined to say we should do this or that. It really is a combination. And what we saw with COVID is that it exacerbated inequalities. So people like me are privileged, have a 4-bedroom home and fairly reliable internet. I actually prefer working at home because it's more convenient. I can play with my dogs all day. But I had people working for me who ended up working in their car because that was the only way they could get away from their children, or people who were embarrassed to turn on their cameras because of the environment that they lived in, or, in lots of parts of Toronto, not just rural and remote communities, among racialized people, for example, 42% of kids are doing their home. I'm not that familiar with your industry and the structure. Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you, Wendy.
Okay, I've turned off my, speaking of stable internet. I'm not so familiar with your industry, but I know in the sector that I work in, remote work was uneven in its impacts. And for some people, they would far prefer to be in the workplace because of the social aspects or because of the conditions that they found themselves having to work in. So I don't think there's a single answer, but really understanding what the situation is and what the preferences are that your employees have, I think is critically important, as well as addressing those technical infrastructure issues that are really important in your industry.
Yeah, you bring up some good points. I'll bring Dr. Lynn in a minute, but Kevin, can I get your take on that? I think Wendy brought up a good point, especially about, different environments for different people. I mean, it's just thinking about TV, for example, not everyone is going to have that perfect work from home shot that everyone's looking for, right? It is different from person to person, right, Kevin?
Yeah, and I think flexibility is actually really important, particularly for people who have caregiving responsibilities, which is, a lot of people. But actually, in terms of equity with these new arrangements, there is one really important consideration that I would add, and that is the existence of something that's called proximity bias. And what this basically means that just as human beings, we are biased favorably towards people who we see, who are in proximity to. And the result is there is a bit of a potential trap here where if you make it optional for people to go into the office when they want to, it's more likely that you would wind up having people who are in dominant groups. So white males maybe who are less likely to have caregiving responsibilities or take those responsibilities, younger workers and others. And the research suggests that workers of color and also women are less likely to come into the office if there's complete flexibility. And the danger is that managers actually, have this bias, basically, as we all do, that they will look less favorably towards the people who they don't see as often. So if you don't come into the office, you're less likely to get one of the plum assignments, you're less likely to get a promotion, you're less likely to get a raise. And the result is that researchers, including Nick Bloom at Stanford, recommend pretty strongly that you actually, if you're going to have a hybrid work situation, that you have to anticipate these biases and how they could play out over a period of time. And their recommendation is that you actually have people come into the office on the same days. There are actually some companies like Quora, the Internet Answers company, where the CEO of Quora has said he will not go into the headquarters more than one day per month. And it's for precisely this reason. He doesn't want to pressure other people to go into the office, and he doesn't want to exhibit this bias of being looking more favorably on people who come into the office, which we know statistically are more likely to be people who are white and in kind of dominant worker groups.
Yeah, it's interesting. Out of sight, out of mind when it comes to that raise, right? Dr. Lin, you've heard the what the first two guests have had to say, and it's likely that we're going to start to go back to some extent or another. How do we move forward safely? How do we do that safely, doctor, for going back to the crowded newsrooms, even if it's just for a day or two a week?
Yeah, and that's complicated because I've seen a lot of patients that have medical conditions and they're afraid to go back in because they don't want to have to go on the GO bus or the train and things like that and it get exposed. So to your point, the marginalized people, the people with medical illnesses, which never popped up ever when they were going to work before COVID, now becomes an issue and it holds them back. They're really fearful. And then so they ask me for notes to kind of make sure that they can stay at home. And then now they look bad that they don't go into work. So that's a big, huge issue. The other issue is there's no boundaries when you're at home. So in other words, when you go to work and then you leave work, they don't really bother you too much, right? And then there's companies that say, we don't want you on your BlackBerry or whatever, your iPhones over the nighttime period at this point. But if you're at home and your email is there and then somebody sends you a request, you're working on it constantly. So I've seen a lot of patients saying that they're burning out faster because they're on all the time. There is no away from work because your work is your desk that you're sitting at. And it's the same desk that you watch your videos on that you're now working on at the same time. So there's no change. So we do have to be careful about that. As far as going back in terms of safely, we just have to keep the mask and distance and those kind of very basic principles in check, because in the end, the virus is brought to you by a human being and it is breathed out and then you have to breathe it in. So those basic things of, mask, distance, those kinds of things are still there, even if people are vaccinated. So the vaccination is sort of, I always tell people it's the last layer of defense. It's like your goalie, but you need your defensemen, you need your forwards to keep the puck away from you. And that's what we need to make sure that people do, whether you're going back into the studio or the office, or whether you're going to a location somewhere else. So let's say you're going into a business and you have to go and interview people, you have to still follow those same rules, whether you're in the office or in a factory, to make sure that you don't get infected and to make sure that you don't accidentally bring viruses to them.
Doctor, you're right about this. You work from home, you're always on, right? I mean, that's certainly true. But I would also, contend that for our field, for journalists and for broadcasters, that was probably always the case. It's kind of a lifestyle as opposed to shift work. But I think you're right. It's something that's been made more pronounced by working at home. Doctor, I'm curious to see what you think about the topic of mental health. How does that fit into the debate about work from home or work from the newsroom?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. One is work from home, you don't see any change. So normally, if you think about your day, you get up, you go out, you leave that environment. But now everybody's sitting there for 24 hours a day and you're looking at the same thing. So really, you don't get anything. You don't even get sunshine. There were blocks of time where I never left the home because we were told to stay at home and things like that. The second thing is this constant fear. See, when there's a hurricane, the disaster happens and then you start rebuilding thereafter. So there's a finite time point, whereas there's no finite time point here, where we're just constantly seeing bad news that's showing up. And it's not just even bad news around us. We're seeing bad news elsewhere being piped into us, right? Because that's the whole idea of the media going across everything. And so it ends up being always bad news that is, and it's the same bad news. And that's the problem. So therefore, it doesn't seem like it's changing. And so that's why we've seen a lot of people having more depression. For people that have paranoid ideations, now they become even more as they're reading about different opinions and different conspiracy theories and things like that. And so the whole world is hyper-focused on this one area. And that's why we have seen mood disorders increasing, even in people that you didn't suspect, but because we put them into an unusual pressure cooker situation. And that's why we're having a lot of difficulties there.
Yeah, and I know it's been tough for journalists, I mean, I can speak personally covering the pandemic, especially early in the pandemic, where you cover it all day. But unlike other stories, once you turn the mic off, you then had to live it. So it was something that really did weigh on your mental health. Wendy, from your perspective, what are some strategies to deal with increasing concerns about mental health?
Well, I think it's a huge part of it is tone from the top and making sure that leaders really get it and also share their own struggles and vulnerabilities, because I do think that I don't know what the newsroom culture is like, but in many organizations, the idea is leaders are always stoical, in control, know everything, and so on. And in that context, you don't create space for people to share that they're struggling. And, in a normal environment where you're all coming into the office, you might notice if somebody seems off, but it's much harder to read what's going on with your employees in this virtual environment. So I think that's critically important. I think also understanding that we always should have recognized that mental health is a critical issue that we have to pay attention to, and healthy work environments are more than traditional notions of health and safety. But I do think, as Dr. Lynn mentioned, we're so aware now of the extent to which mental health issues are creating burnout, driving people out of the workforce, and in some professions, far worse than in others. And so making sure that you've got the appropriate supports for your employees, very important. And while, most healthcare supports have
might have had
gone virtual.
Sorry, Wendy, you just dropped off there for a second. I didn't mean to
sorry.
interrupt you. You finish your thought, Wendy.
Yeah, so I think making sure that you've got access to mental health supports as employees need them, making sure you've got space for conversations about, check-in calls have been.
Wendy just dropped off again. While Wendy gets her connection fixed, I want to go back to Kevin.
Become far more important. Lots.
Sorry, Wendy, you're just in and out there a little bit. We'll come back to you in a sec. Kevin, one of the great things that I've discovered, as someone who produces, a lot of news content every day, is Zoom interviews. Even if I go back to the newsroom, I'm hoping to keep these Zoom interviews going, because prior to this, now you'd have to show up with a camera. It would take time. It's intimidating for some people to have a camera arrive at their home or office. Zoom interviews, easier to get subjects to talk. I'm wondering, Kevin, do you think this is a good thing? And are Zoom interviews here to stay?
I think they are. And there are two reasons for that. One is the reason that you mentioned, which is just that it allows you to cover a lot more ground. I think one of the downsides of all working from our homes is that journalists could potentially just be even more of a bubble than they are traditionally. If there's any legitimate criticism about journalists, in our era, it's that they're closed off from the real people, they're closed off from real news, they're closed off. And I think if, there's certain groups of people who might have tendencies of actually just sitting behind their computer and writing away without actually interfacing with the locations and the people and the reality of the topics they're covering. But to your point, the positive side of this is that it enables you potentially to do a lot more interviews. It cuts down on the friction that it's required to actually get places and bring camera crews and so forth. People are comfortable doing Zoom interviews, and potentially actually increases the access that you're able to have to people who are in the thick of actually these issues and the news. The other thing that I really appreciate is it actually as a journalist, it makes it much easier for me to record and transcribe my interviews. So people are comfortable with you recording a Zoom interview. It's very easy to extract the audio, put that through an automated transcription program, and you actually have a pretty good quality transcript very quickly after doing the interview, which wasn't the case, when I was a newspaper reporter going around in the world and not and just scribbling in my notebook.
Yeah, it makes that web write a lot easier for people who are the many who are doing multi-platform now, right? I mean, and you take the audio out of Zoom, that can be a radio story. It's quick like that, right, Kevin?
Yeah, no, it's great. I think we're as I just to step back, we should have been working like this for decades. We're not industrial workers in our industry, at least. In the people who are journalists, and the approach to working, the structure, the tradition, the assumptions are all rooted in the post-World War II era, where a lot of the management and work practices that we use were codified. And the fact is, we should, when we're writing a story, working on a report, it's great for us just to be hunkered down at home if that's how we're going to do it. It's great for us to use these tools. And the only reason that we didn't use them really was because people just assumed that you couldn't do it. You had to show up in the office to be doing meaningful work. You had to be going in person to interview people to actually, get them to talk to you. And I think that we're at a really, for newsrooms, we're at a really exciting moment where the way we should have been working that didn't feel possible is actually now possible, and it's been required. But we hope to, we emerge from this period with our practices changed pretty dramatically.
Wow. I mean, it's elevated the technology too, don't you think, Kevin? I mean, it's astounding now where you can go live on your iPhone and it looks really good. I mean, that's really brought that to the forefront, the pandemic has, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And, it's technology across a bunch of different areas that the tech providers have actually invested in because so many people are using, but also it's just made it, possible and obvious to people that they should be using them. Among the other things that, in my experience is really valuable is communication platforms like Slack. So you can effectively have a newsroom's whole workflow set up in different channels on Slack or Teams or whatever channel you use. And so everyone can actually have visibility into what story ideas are being considered, what the status of the story is, if people are looking for sources, when the stories are published so that they can actually share them on social media. I think that that also is another technology that's incredibly powerful over time for news organizations.
But we as journalists, we rely, I think, a lot too on obviously on our interactions with people. Dr. Lin, do you have any comment on this as far as the value of in-person interaction? Like, are we losing something when we're just using Zoom to do an interview, Doctor?
For sure. I mean, the whole being in front of somebody, I think, is still very important. And also the decision to send a crew to go and interview somebody means that this is an important story. So one of the problems that we see is as technology makes it more accessible, it's better. Okay. Lots of people have access to it, but also a lot of, I guess, noise will come up. Not the greatest stories and those kinds of things may pop up. We saw this in the area of publications. If you just put the word COVID in it, then you get published on this preprint server, which nobody looks at, but then you're published in that sense, and then people start referencing it. And so a lot of the media outlets started to pick up on those stories, and then later on they have to retract it or that it wasn't quite accurate, those kinds of things. So the only thing that I worry about with this ubiquitous usage is let's just make sure the quality is good. And then that way the end user, the person that's watching this, is going to know that the information is correct, it's been verified, those kinds of things. But I found that when the technology is really easy for people to use, there may be a level less scrutiny in terms of making sure that the facts are right, and that may cause a problem. So I've seen some of that happen in the medical world, definitely, as these studies of like 3 people get published. I'm going, how do 3 people get published? Like, I mean, obviously nobody looked at it. So that would be the only small drawback, which I think most of the respectful journalists know about. In other words, they want good quality information, and all this technology just makes it easier for them to get the interview. But there's nothing that replaces a live face-to-face. I visited my nephew's son, And he's seen us on this little box inside the Zoom all the time when we meet. And then when you see him in live person, it's like the interaction is completely different. So I think the live interaction is still useful, but certainly in terms of technology, it's made it easier for us to get information moving back and forth.
Yeah, and for those of us that meet with contacts or sources and that sort of thing, I mean, speaking personally, starting to go back to some of the in-person lunches, you can't really replace that sort of thing. Doctor, I want to stick with you on when we talk about going back to the office or staying home, you're going to have the vaccine debate come up, hesitancy, disclosure. How do you think, as a doctor, how do you think newsrooms or workplaces in general should approach that tricky debate and question?
Yeah, and this is a very tricky debate because it's creating division. Remember, when we first started this thing, we all worked together. So the enemy is the virus, okay? The enemy is not the vaccine. It's not the person pushing the vaccine. So we were working together as a common goal. And I've seen that fractionate now recently. So I think what we should be doing is we should be looking at vaccine as a very, very good tool. Just like the mask is a very good tool, distance is a very good tool, ventilation is a very good tool. And let's use all our tools together. And if we can do that, I think that would be more helpful, more constructive. So in other words, let's all come together to get rid of the virus as opposed to sort of fractionating people off. And we now know that the vaccine is the same that we give people, but it's the response that's different. So in other words, one person may make lots of antibodies, one person maybe make less, maybe because they're older, maybe because they have medical conditions. So I don't want people to think I'm double vaccinated, I'm Superman, I can do whatever I want, because we're starting to see, for example, Ontario, they report the number of people that are fully vaccinated that are picking up the virus. Now, it is true, they don't get very sick, which is fantastic, but they are picking up the virus. So therefore, I think that it's a very good tool. Like I said, it's like the goalie, but then you need the other team members there. And I think if we focus on the team players, then I think people will probably accept that a lot better than just focusing on you must have the goalie or else you can't come, that kind of thing. And I've seen people fractionating badly, and within families, they are arguing and they're getting divorces that we've heard in the US, but that is usually very extreme down there. But you can see that this becomes an issue, whereas the common goal is the same. None of us want to get sick. We all want to go back to our lives. And if that means that I have to wear a mask around strangers, I'm okay with that, to do that. So perhaps what we have to do is just come back to the common goal, is that we don't want to get sick and we want to be able to do things like see your family, go see a movie, go on vacation. Those are the common things that we're sharing.
Well, Kevin is down there, as we like to say. Kevin, is this an issue in like US newsrooms, journalists vaccinated, not vaccinated? What's the deal with that?
Yeah, so there are two issues that have come up in this time. One, obviously, there's a broader national discussion about vaccination, and my own personal view, and I think that this is pretty close to what most of the news organizations are doing, is that vaccination should be required when you're in a workplace setting, when you're interacting with other people, when you're a frontline journalist who is out in the community. This is a public health consideration, and just as we require certain vaccinations for other diseases that we want to eradicate, that it's permissible to actually require vaccination with obviously exemptions for medical conditions or like very limited cases, religious or other exemptions. So I would argue that the issue that we're seeing in some cases in newsrooms here is the role of the union in the newsrooms and what, say, the union that is representing the journalists has in the decisions of the organization about when and how and under what conditions the journalists will be returning to the newsrooms. There was a moment where it felt like that was going to erupt into something bigger than the specific issues. It seems to have subsided a fair amount, and in the spirit of Dr. Lynn's entreaty that we need to all kind of figure this out together. I think that news organizations, my sense here, are actually constructively figuring these things out. But this issue does touch a lot of the questions about flexibility, work expectations, performance, what someone's job is, how many hours a week they work, and from where, that are traditionally negotiated between employers and unions on behalf of their representatives. And I think those conversations and some of the contentious issues there, you know, they're so far we're navigating that, it seems like, but I don't think we're through.
Interesting. Hey, Wendy, I know you did some polling on people's attitudes to working at home. What did you find from that? And what surprised you from what you found, Wendy? Wendy, you're on mute, I do believe. Wendy, we can't hear you at the moment. Oh, there you are, Wendy. We still can't hear you. We'll come back to Wendy. Doctor, I want to ask you. Oh, there you are, Wendy. Go ahead.
Apologies. So I think, you know, what's saying a lot about the impact of work at home or live at work as it's become. But in fact, in the polling, a lot of people want to continue working at home. And the most popular arrangement is, as Kevin mentioned, a hybrid model, but it's certainly not the universal preference. Very few people want to come back to work full time. So again, we see differences based on family status, based on race, based on location. And I did want to really underscore one of the advantages of going to remote work that I'm not sure anybody has mentioned is there is a certain level of democratization, because living in downtown Toronto is very expensive. And the cost of having cheaper accommodation in the suburbs is the cost of commuting. And so if you think about it, what's happened is now newsrooms have access both to talent as well as experts, regardless of where they live. And, you know, I've spent lots of my time, you know, getting into Metro Morning for 6 o'clock so that I could be in studio. And it's way easier when someone calls you, you can roll out of bed and do the interview. So I do think the points that were made about trying to maintain those aspects of this is critically important.
A very good point, indeed. You know, not all journalists, though, have been able to work from home, of course, during the pandemic. You know, you have to have reporters out there on the street. And Doctor, that involves journalists interviewing people who, in some cases, obviously haven't been vaccinated. You know, you might be at an anti-vax protest. You might be dealing with certain communities who are more reluctant to get vaccinated or even to wear a mask. But reporters still have to talk to them. How can reporters do that safely, Doctor?
You know, I wish that we can see the cloud of virus that comes out of your face. Like if you saw this white cloud, you would just stay clear of that white cloud. So it's actually direct face-to-face contact. So a person has to breathe out the virus and then you have to suck it in. So that mechanics hasn't changed at all since the beginning of the pandemic. And so that's why you see the reporters standing that 6 or 7 feet away with the boom mics and all that kind of stuff, doing it outdoors, for example, and making sure, or we've had a couple of situations where they had to do it indoors, but they put a fan that blew across between the two people. So that way the virus is heading in that direction and it's not going to be going directly across. And if we sort of misalign them a little bit, so instead of having them directly facing each other, if we just misalign them a little bit, then the airflow is not going to be directly going towards them as well. So there are things that we can make it safe in those situations. The tougher one is the one in the crowd. You know, you're at a protest and a rally and you're in a crowd and you're surrounded by people. That's much more difficult for the reporter. And even if the reporter is fully vaccinated, as we said, not everybody makes the same antibodies. For example, hepatitis B, we know that there are about 10% of the people that never make any antibodies. You know, after 6 shots, they still don't make it. And so that's why I want reporters, if they've been vaccinated, we still need to take care. Because let's say a new Delta Plus comes along that, you know, is not good with the virus or the vaccine, then we would still be at risk. So therefore, we do need to try and keep that distance. The one that's bad is when you're in the crowd right in front of people. And this is where you have to avoid the shouting people, because that's where the virus is going to be coming from. I haven't
brought up
seen
some
any
good points there, Doctor. Sorry to interrupt you, but the tips for journalists who are out in the field, you said stand not directly
that's
facing
right.
each
So
other. Mention some
if
tips.
you're interviewing somebody, then you don't want to be face to face to them. So you just misalign a little bit. The camera will still see that you're in line, but then you're actually in separate. So now their air coming out is not directly coming towards you. And then if you put some distance, then basically the viruses will fall off, you know, because they have no ability to increase their speed. They can't fly. They don't have wings, right? So they come on our breath. and then you have to suck it in. So that's the other interesting thing. When I go really close to a patient to examine their eye, I will tell the patient, you hold your breath and I hold my breath. And then for that split second, the virus isn't moving anywhere. So therefore, if you are near people, so let's say I'm a reporter, I'm amongst a whole bunch of people running around me. If I just hold my breath for a few seconds and then back away, then I'm not going to be sucking in the virus. So there are things that we can do to make it safer. So even if you're fully vaccinated or not vaccinated, it doesn't matter. You can try these techniques to stop you from sucking in that particular virus.
Kevin, are we missing out on stories because of this? You know, we've been accused of, hey, not covering the big anti-vax protest because, quite frankly, we didn't want to send a reporter there because it wasn't safe. Are we missing out on stories, Kevin?
I think I think I would have answered yes more readily about 12 months ago or even 6 months ago. My own observation is that reporters are out there in the field now. And then particularly since more and more of us are vaccinated, you know, reporters want to be out in the field. They want to do their jobs. They want to talk to people. They want to get the story. And with the comfort, and, you know, as Dr. Lin says, it's not a perfect protection, but with the comfort that at least there's a baseline of vaccination that makes it less likely that you would be seriously ill if you contracted the virus. I think people are you know, out there, they're on planes, they are going to places where they know that people are not vaccinated, because that's what we do. You know, it's like correspondents going into conflict zones. There is a physical danger, but we're driven to find what's going on and do our best to report it back to people.
Kevin, I'm curious to know where you think what's the newsroom going to look like, say, in 10 years? You know, let's say we can start to go back hybrid. Maybe we keep that. Like, where do you see this industry like 10 years from now?
And your question is also about the robots that will be replacing us as well, and the VR glasses that we'll all be wearing to do our interviews.
The industry was already in flux before COVID came along, right?
Yeah, no, the industry was definitely in flux. And for what it's worth, I have confidence that the bulk of the journalism jobs will not be replaced by robots, because we're good at doing a lot of things that automation is actually not doing. And namely, you know, talking to people and using our brains to synthesize and try and see around corners. But I think that, you know, the newsrooms of the future will look a lot like offices more broadly. And, you know, there are a number of things that you can think about. So, and it goes back to some of the things that we've been talking about. So interestingly, research shows that the open plan newsrooms that a lot of us have grown up in, actually are not super conducive for doing individual work. Researchers have found that levels of ambient stress are actually higher when you're in these sort of situations, and actually that they're not particularly good for your mental health. Some people may thrive in them, but for a lot of people, there is this sort of ambient sense that people are, you know, watching them or listening in on their conversations, and there's stress and distraction, actually. And so I think that what newsrooms of the future should look like are spaces where people can come together and congregate, where the activity is very explicitly conversation, collaboration, socializing to some degree. And then spaces where you can go and, you know, an office or a small, you know, maybe not a full office, but a sort of cupboard that you can go into and actually do the focus work that you want to do. And for both individuals and managers, there needs to be an adjustment to what this all means. You know, it used to be as a manager in a newsroom, and if someone was spending their whole day at the photocopier or having coffee with colleagues, you would say, like, you know, that would come up in their performance review, that they're not doing enough work, they're not focused enough. But the fact is that now, when we have hybrid working arrangements in particular, those sort of activities are really important for the cohesion of teams, for the sharing of ideas, for the cross currents of connection and ideas within organizations. And so the person who comes into the office and goes and sits at their laptop and just sits there typing for 8 hours and doesn't go off to lunch with a colleague and and doesn't really interact with other people, you might traditionally have thought, wow, that person's an amazing worker. But in fact, that's not what people should be doing in offices. And so I think that the practices and the configurations of newsrooms will change actually pretty quickly over the next few years, and we'll see that. And then obviously the last thing is ventilation. So Mung, as Dr. Lin, I'm sure would say, has been talking about a lot. One of the keys to safer workplaces is not putting ourselves in these buildings that are hermetically sealed with the windows closed and all breathing each other's air, but rather finding ways to open to natural air, to have outdoor spaces that can be used when the weather permits. That's another change I think we'll see as well.
Yeah, there's a couple of buildings. There was a couple of buildings where they designed it after a termite hill, right? So the termite sacks basically suck air in from the bottom and goes up, and it keeps it very cool, even though there's millions of termites in there generating heat. So there've been a couple of buildings designed like that, and I would suspect that in the future we want that kind of airflow going in there to make people safe. So all that, flu that we had, everybody was prepared for flu, that we're going to get sick anyways. Maybe we can get rid of a lot of those kind of illnesses at the same time that we're getting rid of COVID as well. And I think I like your comment about collaboration. Even though we're on a Zoom call, I'm not going to interrupt you. I'm going to let you finish your conversation. But if we were sitting around a table, I would say, oh, no, Kevin, I think this should, so that is all lost. Like, we have very good etiquette, which is we wait for people to finish speaking and then we take turns. And that's when the new ideas, they don't come. And I must admit, for journalism, I've watched them sitting in that open concept and able to edit and do things. Like, if I ever form a company, I will totally hire those people because they're so focused, even though there's like a gazillion things moving around them and bells and ringing, and they can sit there and focus like as if they're just in a calm place. So I have a funny feeling the people that can perform in those situations are special. They have this skill of blocking out everything. And I think that skill is going to be appreciated by people, because that's not easy. Because I sat in there one time, I was waiting for the time to go on to television. I'm going, I can't even hear myself think, because there's so much stuff going around. And I was like a ADHD person, looking around everywhere as things are popping and clicking. So it is a special person that can work in that environment where you have all this distraction, but they can tune it all out.
Love the fact that you would hire us, because journalists now, we're looking for backup plans, doctor. It's always good. Hey, Wendy, we're coming up to the end of the year, and a lot of newsrooms do the performance reviews, as companies on a whole do. Do you think, Wendy, that we're at any disadvantage if we're working at home and we have that performance review with our newsroom manager?
It depends if your newsroom manager is also working at home, so back to the point about proximity bias. I do think that in some respects, as has been mentioned, a lot of the approaches to evaluating people have come from impressions. And in this current environment, I think there's less impressionistic assessment and more tendency to actually look at outcomes, outputs, and so on. And we've had to do that to accommodate the flexibility that workers want. So, my sense is a lot of organizations are going soft on performance appraisals because it's been just such a tough year. And if people are still working, that's actually a good thing, because we've seen people leaving the workforce in droves, especially women. So I think it depends a lot on how your organization is functioned and how formal your performance indicators were in the past versus where they are now. I will say, though, that we have to have a diversity and inclusion lens on all of these discussions. We have to think about how women are affected differently. We have to think about racialized people, the Black community in particular, Indigenous people, and so on, and really think about the advantages and disadvantages from that perspective. The brainstorming environments for women and for others, not so good, right? There's a phenomenon of the echo chamber where a woman says something, it's ignored, man says something, and it's a great idea. So, and those pathologies play out in most environments. So in some ways, when you introduce technology, you can actually control for a lot of the things that didn't work well in meetings, that didn't work well when it was easier to go to, Ryerson Yonge and Dundas than it was to go up to Brampton to interview someone. So I think we need to be careful about, as I said, really simplistic solutions or analyses.
A good point there, Wendy. You're just breaking up again. Kevin, you have a thought on
Yeah, I can
reviews,
jump in
Kevin?
here and build on what Wendy was saying.
Go ahead, Kevin.
So on the broader topic of reviews, there's a fair amount of research that suggests that performance reviews are not an ideal, an annual performance review is not an ideal thing. And in fact, what people need is continuous feedback. The model that I like, I have a friend, a former Wall Street Journal editor, Sam Walker, who studied sports teams and dynasties where they had a sustained championships over time. And the only thing that he could find that correlated with ongoing success of a sports team was not the coach. It really wasn't anything apart from the captain of the team. And if you had a great captain of a team, then that was an attribute that it was very directly correlated with sports team success. And when you think about how teams operate, the coach is the person who trains the team. They get them to the moment when the game starts. And then it's the captain who's actually on the field or on the ice or on the court. And what they're doing is actually giving continuous feedback and direction to the other players. That sort of model that organizations, including news organizations, should be thinking about, training their managers to be giving continuous feedback. And to Wendy's point about some of the biases that we have around performance reviews, the research shows that individuals of color and women in particular tend to actually get assessed in performance reviews on different things and tend not to get as much actionable feedback. So it tends to be things about, these sort of subjective qualities like executive presence or attitude or things like that they're more likely to be judged on. And a really significant percentage of workers of color actually don't think that they're being fairly assessed in performance reviews. And the result is that, they're less likely to stay within a company, which is pretty significant now for a lot of companies as they focus on inclusion and amid a lot of the resignations that are going on. So there is, I guess just to sum up what I say about performance reviews, having a performance review once a year is better than having no feedback during the year. So at the very least, there's one structured moment. But in general, organizations should be moving to continuous feedback. And it's really important, particularly given the equity and diversity lens, that everyone is given feedback that is specific, that is in the moment, that's actionable, and that stays away from some of these very subjective and really questionable attributes like attitude and potential.
But you have anything
I was thinking
at
our office, we started just acknowledging people. We said, thanks for working the extra shift on Friday night. I know you took time out of your office or something like that. And I think something like that is very helpful because it's immediate. So I did something, I worked overtime for, Dr. Lin, and then he said, thank you. That connection is very useful. Whereas if they work, and then at the end of the year, you say, hey, good job, it's disconnected from the action. So I found that if we can just give a little bit of positive feedback at the moment when people do those things, that's going to be more beneficial. It'll have more impact than something that comes 8 months later, say, thanks very much for working that extra shift for me. So I think something like that may be helpful. And because everybody's away and in their homes, you don't get that immediate feedback. Whereas if you're seen at the newsroom and you're staying over because there's a breaking story and you're working on it, people walking by you, hey, thanks for staying, to cover it, right? So you get something. And even though it's not monetary, it's nothing like that, but you just get something. I was doing something and then they acknowledged it. I think that connection is gone because everybody's at home, working until 3 o'clock in the morning, and you're not going to get a thumbs up from somebody at 3 o'clock in the morning that the email that you sent. So I think if we did that, if you see an email coming at 3 o'clock, I'm trying to get myself to send back saying, hey, thanks for staying up to do this, and that simple thing will make it more likely for me to keep doing the good things that people acknowledge.
I love getting a quick note from my news director. So any news directors watching, it makes a big difference. Hey, doctor, have journalists done a good job covering the pandemic? Give us the honest answer.
Yeah, I think so. The only thing is that you're limited by what you're given. right? So in other words, if the public health people only give you 450 people got sick today, what can you report? 450 people got sick today, right? And I think it's been very useful. The only problem is sometimes our public health messaging has been wrong, right? So in other words, wash your hands. And then they say, well, that's just not that big a deal, you know? So that part of it has been a little bit difficult, but definitely the media coverage. I mean, we now have people knowing what an mRNA vaccine is. My goodness. I mean, we didn't know what this was in the medical field. Now we have all these people saying, oh yeah, I'm going to get an mRNA. I'm going to get this one versus this one. I mean, the level of knowledge that has gone up, there is no way that we as physicians or healthcare providers or anything like that could have raised the knowledge base of the world, basically. So that was all because of journalists, media coming up with these things and making it simple. You know, we're very good at making it complicated. We use big words and we think everybody understands them, but the journalism and the media has made it accessible. So that way people know about what these things are. And I guess in a weird way, people are saying, you know, there's a lot of discussion. And I think that's good because it means that people understand about it and care about it. And who made that happen? It was the journalists that were doing it. So that's why the quality of the journalism is very high. And I want to maintain that. So I don't want somebody like me trying to think I can do journalism because when I do my pieces, you know, for the radio, I have no idea what are good questions to ask. You know, they always ask me good questions. And then from there, I can shine because they asked me a good question. Whereas if you leave it up to me, I'll talk about nonsense that nobody cares about. So that's why, you know, it's so important for our journalists to feel appreciated in this during this time. And the knowledge base has been incredible. Like the number of things that people talk about around the water cooler is really quite high level science that nobody has ever talked about before.
Just got a text from my news director saying how great you are. She's watching, Amber. I didn't know that. Hi, Amber. You're wonderful. Kevin, we're going to get set to wrap this up. And by the way, if anyone has any questions, please chat them in and we can ask the panel here as we get set to round this out. Any thoughts, Kevin, about again where we're going to go going forward here, and you know who knows what's going to lie ahead with the virus? How do you think we've been covering the pandemic 18 months in, Kevin?
You know, I think news organizations have been done a really good job generally. I think that the landscape for our work is more complicated, and the easiest way to see that is by looking at Facebook, and to Dr. Lynn's point earlier, the way in which non-news organizations have been able to masquerade as news sources and share non-accurate information that has been amplified by Facebook. And you know, there are lots of government officials and others who have views about Facebook's own willing cooperation with that. But so I think it's, you know, it's a particularly challenging time. So many things changed, but also the news sort of environment has changed. And I think that, you know, I feel good about how journals have performed in this period. I think that one thing that has been, you know, that we take forward with us that's been probably good is a certain level of humility. So none of us, or very few of us at the least, you know, anticipated this sort of worldwide crisis. And even once we were into it, very few of us really could have predicted exactly how it played out, including in terms of work and the economy and our workforces. And I think that is an important lesson. We don't know the answers. We probably can look to different sources and even more rigorous reporting to try and keep people better informed. But it's also just useful to know that, like, we're doing our best. We don't know how this is going to turn out, and there are lots of scenarios that we're not going to be able to anticipate.
Kevin, now that everything's working really technically well in the field or at home, do you think broadcasters who are strapped for cash, of which there are many, I think, do you think they might just say, hey, we're going to sell the studio, we're going to sell the building, the newsroom, we're going to give up that rent that we're paying, we don't have to pay that anymore? Is that going to happen?
Yeah, I don't know about broadcasters, because I think that, you know, my sense is that they're probably going to downsize, and I think that the era of the elaborate, extremely costly studio complex is probably over. And what it will be replaced by is more satellite studios and home broadcasting configurations. So yeah, I think it'll kick off another wave. I do think that a lot of organizations are going to reduce their real estate footprint once they kind of get back and see what exactly is required. I know that there will be different types of facilities and gatherings for people to come together. You know, there's a lot of discussion about how the organizational offsite is this new area that people have not completely thought through or really invested in traditionally. That becomes even more important when you have your workforce distributed to bring them together to move things forward and gather together. So I think, yeah, I guess the bottom line is I do think that news organizations' real estate footprints will shrink, and they'll be making different kinds of investments than they have been.
I saw a tweet from a New York-based journalist recently, and she was tweeting out they have one of the broadcasters, I think it was a CNN or a Fox, they had a van set up, and inside the van was a camera and a TV backdrop. So if they wanted to interview someone, they'd shoot the van around and they'd come out of the house, get in the van and do a live remote. Hey, Wen, did you think this whole situation, pandemic, it's going to result in job losses? I mean, we just had, Kevin talking about downsizing. Do you think this is going to result in job losses?
Sector by sector, there's acute job shortages right now in manufacturing. In my world, we can't find qualified writers.
Early in the pandemic when I was broadcasting live from home and we'd have the internet thing, internet connection issues are always annoying, but when you're live on the air, there's nothing worse. You just want to throw the computer out the window. Sorry, Wendy, you dropped out there again. Finish your thought, Wendy, please.
Sorry, I was just saying it's sector by sector. Healthcare, acute shortages. Manufacturing, acute shortages. Transportation, logistics, acute shortages. In my world, we're having trouble hiring writers and researchers. In your world, not so sure. I do think that one of the issues in broadcast journalism and journalism, like generally, is regardless of what's happening with the mainstream organizations, and this is sort of what Dr. Lynn was saying earlier, we're seeing fragmentation. So we're seeing people develop podcasts and their own little private newsletters and so on. Those things are actually taking jobs away from mainstream broadcasters and newspapers. But overall, are there fewer people doing that work? Hard to say.
Yeah, boy, an interesting debate, and one that I know newsrooms are going to continue to have and journalists are going to continue to have. I want to thank everyone so much for a great talk. I'm going to bring back in Owen. Owen, over to you.
Thank you so much for that, Richard. And thank you to Wendy, Kevin, and Peter for a fascinating discussion today. The RTDNA is right now planning more upcoming webinars. So if you have any ideas or topics you'd like to see us cover, just shoot us a note at events@rtdnacanada.com. Again, that's events@rtdnacanada.com. And before I go, I just want to make a plug. We got a great comment here from Jane Hawks. She says, the Canadian Journalism Forum on Violence and Trauma has launched the first of its kind national survey on mental health and well-being in the Canadian journalism community. Co-leaders in the study are Carleton Journalism's Matthew Pearson and CBC's Dave Seglins. We are inviting all journalists and media workers to participate and have their voices heard. Whether staff, freelancers, big data, will help us to do better to better understand the issues and how we can help ourselves and support our colleagues. So if you'd like to take part in that, which we encourage you to do so, you can check it out on Twitter @JournalismForum or on their website, www.journalismforum.ca. On behalf of the RTDNA, thank you so much for joining us today and have a great week.
Thanks, everybody.
You take care.